Welcome to Break the Silence, Build the Future, a podcast dedicated to amplifying the voices of survivors and advocates while shedding light on the pervasive issue of gender based violence. Join us on a journey where survivors find strength in sharing their stories and experts offer profound insight into this critical societal issue. Grief unspoken, the cost of avoiding pain. In this episode, I'll explore the emotional and psychological cost of avoiding grief, in my opinion, and what are some of the reasons we suppress or avoid the pain of loss, and how this kind of avoidance impacts you. At least it impacted me in the process of dealing with the loss of my daughter, Zahra Bullet. If you don't know, if you don't follow me, if you haven't heard any of it, my daughter Zahra Adam Bula went missing on May 26th of 2023. And 12 days later, her husband of 18 years had been arrested for the first degree of her murder. But then I was plunged into this unimaginable well of pain, unimaginable well of grief, unimaginable well of loss. And I didn't really know how to process it. I had no language to process because what parent expects to lose a child and have a language for it? I didn't. And I've known people in my community, parents in my community that have lost children. But there was really no one speaking to it, not at least I could find that somebody that spoke to it and said, this is how I felt, this is how I processed it, this is how I dealt with it. So it was like blindfolded, being thrown in this well of pain and grief and not knowing how to process it, not having language to express it or understand it, not at least the language that complemented my way of thought, my way of process. You can read all the books you want, but is that something that will be helpful to you? Would you understand? Would you know how to deal with it? The focus of this episode is not to bring a knowledge that's, wow, I didn't know this, but to encourage you, my listeners, to be okay to confront your grief rather than letting it fester beneath the surface. Just encouraging you and leading the way myself in showing you or giving you the permission by saying, yeah, she's talking about it, I can talk about it too, in confronting your grief, even if you don't talk about it publicly, so you're not letting it fester underneath all that pain. In my opinion, grief is one of the hardest emotions we face. And the easiest way to respond to it is to avoid it altogether, to not speak to it, to not say anything about it, to just suffer in silence. I have done that for the first few months of my daughter's loss. I have tried not to approach and speak about the grief. I spoke around it. I spoke about my anger of the loss, my anger of the lack of support my daughter had experienced as she was going through those 18 terrible years, and the lack of support my family had experienced, I had experienced as her mother. So I spoke around the grief. I didn't speak to the grief. And that only prolonged the pain. We're talking about the cost of avoiding grief and perhaps encouraging you to face it, to look at it in the face. And this episode is for anyone and everyone who's ever tried to outrun their pain, because that's what I did for the first few months. Why do we avoid grief? And remember, this is based on my personal experience. We avoid grief because what else is there to do? Facing it, looking at it, feels unbearable, especially if this is a loss of a child, like in my case. My loss challenged everything that I believed, everything I thought, routines of life, every way I knew relationships should work, my sense of identity. Because no parent should bury a child. That's not how it works. That's not the logical process of it. I had tendency to avoid grief more than I can count. I pushed down the pain of losing my father in 1993, a man I loved more than life itself, believing I had to be strong for my young children. I avoided that grief. I remember it took me over a decade, 13 years to be exact, to even visit my father's grave. I avoided the heartbreak of my failed marriage because survival seemed more urgent. I needed to survive. I couldn't look at that grief. I couldn't allow the grief to come into my life because I thought it would destroy me if I did. I needed to survive. I needed to survive for my children. I needed to survive for myself. I needed to survive so I can get an education. I needed to survive so I could go on and get a job and go to work every day. I needed to survive. That at the time seemed more urgent. I never thought about that I could allow grief to be part of that process. I never thought I could carry that grief with me and make it part of my new normal. I didn't know that. And I ignored the grief of watching my mother disappear into Alzheimer's because I didn't know how to process losing her piece by piece. My mother is still alive in the sense of breathing in and breathing out. But over the years, since 2011, I continuously lost pieces, piece by piece. But I've never thought to stop. I thought taking care of her was more important. Being there for her in the physical sense, getting her to the doctor, getting her medication, getting her support system was more important. If I allowed grief to enter, if I allowed that grief to be part of me, if I let that come in, then it will destroy me and I wouldn't be able to do things that I needed to do for her. But after losing my daughter, and suffering the greatest loss of all, I realized avoiding grief doesn't make it any smaller. In fact, it makes it bigger. The pain we push aside doesn't disappear. It waits, growing heavier with time, growing heavier with age. When we avoid grief, it just doesn't sit quietly in the background. It affects every part of our lives. We might feel this constant anxiety and the weight we cannot explain. I did. We might struggle with emotional numbness. I remember at some point I felt like when you sit on your leg under you and then later on it feels numb and you can't even walk on it. That's how I began to feel. That's what I call emotional numbness. For the first time, I suffered this huge anxiety that I feel like I am about to fall off the cliff. And I was angry with the system, health system, legal system, justice system, police system. I was angry for not supporting. For me, avoiding grief came with a huge lost. I found myself unable to connect fully with others, friends I had for years. I wasn't able to connect with them, and I wasn't able to express or explain why was it. I had a coffee with a dear friend of mine a few days ago, and she's telling me I sent her a text telling her that I wasn't ready to connect or to do anything. That's not what I meant. That was my way of trying to explain how I was feeling, but I wasn't explaining it well, which pushed my friend away instead of being there for me because she didn't know how to deal with it. Because I was holding so much inside, I felt disconnected from my own emotions. Also, grief robs us the opportunity to keep the person we love with us. Because love is on the other side of loss. It's like a mirror reflection of it. And you can't have one without the other. And if you decide you're going to avoid grief, that means you're going to avoid love. You're going to avoid connection. You're going to avoid community. You're going to prevent yourself from embracing the new normal that you're facing, because this is a new normal for you. But that doesn't mean you have to accept the way I am dealing with it to be yours. You can face grief in your own terms. So how do we stop avoiding grief and start facing it? The first step, in my opinion, is to give yourself permission to feel. Let yourself feel the pain. I am reminding myself to feel the pain just as I'm reminding you. Remind yourself that grief is not a sign of weakness. It's a natural response to a loss. For me, facing grief meant carving out moments of quiet reflection. Sometimes that was writing in a journal. Other times sitting with my emotions without judgment. I also found that talking to others, whether through therapy, community, or even my advocacy work, helped me process the pain I had avoided for so long. Also, I want to remind you, confronting grief doesn't mean confronting it all at once. Take it one step at a time and trust that this is a journey, not a destination. There is no destination for you to get to where you could say, okay, I am done grieving, I'm moving on. It's a journey, one step after the other. And there's no way to get around that. There is no cheater door to get through and get to a certain kind of destination, because there is no destination, because you cannot go back. There is no way for me to go back Friday morning of May 26, 2023, when my daughter got up to go to work and I got up to go to work and everything was fine. I cannot go back. If you cannot go back there, if you don't have a time travel to get back to where you were before the loss, then there is no destination, just a journey. Grief is hard. I'm not going to tell you it's going to be easy. By looking at it, by facing it, by embracing it, by allowing it to be part of your new normal, part of your new identity, part of your new way of doing things, makes it easier, I'd be lying to you. It's not easy. It's really hard, but avoiding it makes it harder. By facing our pain, we honor the love, the loss, and the growth that comes with it. Let me say that again. By facing it, by facing the grief, by allowing it to be part of a new normal, part of our new identity, part of the new way we look at things, we think of things, we express things. We honor the love. We honor the loss. We honor the growth that comes with it. When I say that honor loss, people might think that is contradictory. And I agree with you. It is contradictory. But life itself is contradictory. The process itself is contradictory. Once we are in the land of grieving, we are already in a contradictory situation. When we lost the person we loved more than anything, when we lost relationships that we love. But the only way we could do is face it and allow it to enter, open the door, perhaps gradually, not wide open all at once, but gradually open the door, one step at a time, until you get to a place where you can open the whole way and look what's contained inside. Thank you for joining me today. If this episode resonated with you, I would love to hear your story. Whether you are just starting to face your grief or have been on this journey for a while, I would love to hear from you. Next time, we'll talk about the power of resilience and the strength that comes from owning your story. Until then, take care of yourself and remember, you are not alone. And your grief is valid. The way you approach it is valid. And your pain is valid. Thank you for joining us. Please remember to like, follow, subscribe, and share. And join us next week for another episode of the podcast, Break the Silence and Build the Future.